All right, buckle up. Let's talk about Christians and why do they keep some of the Old Testament commandments and not others? Are they just making it all up? Let's find out.
Do Christians today just arbitrarily decide which commandments from the Hebrew Bible they want to continue to be relevant and which they don't? Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion. Let's take a look at a video.
That's my point.
That's convenient.
You're picking the one you don't want to keep for other reasons and saying that one doesn't apply. Why not say the other ones don't apply?
Why do Christians seem to follow some of the commands from the Old Testament, but not others?
Simple, because some of the commandments hurt feelings, and depending on which side aisle you are, it doesn't benefit their worldview. And well, some things that are written in the Old Testament are, well, icky.
This video makes it appear like Christians are arbitrarily or maybe even nefariously picking and choosing the commands that they like while ignoring the ones they don't. The problem with this characterization is it doesn't accurately represent Christianity. It's a straw man.
All right, let's see it.
If you actually want to understand why Christians believe homosexual behavior is sinful, but wearing two different fabrics isn't, you need to understand the covenants. More specifically, the Old Testament contains the Mosaic Law. These were laws given by God through Moses to the chosen people of Israel to accomplish a very specific purpose. When Jesus came, he fulfilled the requirements of the law, and he established a new covenant through his death and resurrection.
Funny enough, the New Covenant, if you look in the Old Testament, it doesn't remove the law. It actually says we still follow it. New Covenant just means that the law becomes something inherent inside of you and you just follow it wholeheartedly and you know all the commandments to it as well. Weird that that's what he mentions, but okay.
That's really important too. Under this new covenant, we can wear clothes with two different fabrics, and it's not because Christians are arbitrarily picking and choosing which commandments to follow. No, it's because Christians are following commands that apply to them under the new covenant. See your New Testament for more details.
So it is 100% arbitrary, and the biggest problem with punting to the New Testament for more details is if you go look in the New Testament, you will not find a single consistent framework for which laws continue to be relevant and which do not, much less why certain laws continue to be relevant and certain laws do not. The most popular frameworks for understanding which continue to be relevant and which do not for Christians are actually not in the New Testament at all. They were things that later Christians arbitrarily made up as they rationalized which laws should continue to be relevant and which should not. But let's start with what's in the New Testament. You actually have a spectrum of approaches, all the way from every last part of the law of Moses and then some extra things, down to none of the law of Moses and then some extra things. So if we look in the Gospel of Matthew, the author of Matthew was a Judaizer. You have to keep the law of Moses if you're a follower of Jesus, because heaven and earth will pass away before a single jot or tittle of the law passes away. Jesus came not to destroy, but to fulfill. Christians today will say, oh, well, he did fulfill the law. We're no longer under the law. You got to read the next two verses where Jesus says, anyone who teaches people not to do these things or breaks the least of these commandments, they're going to be called least in the kingdom of heaven. The one who does them and teaches others to do them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. And then Jesus says, your righteousness must exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees, or you will not see the kingdom of heaven. And then he starts quoting commandments and then ratcheting up their severity. You have heard the law says this, while I tell you this higher law. So the author of Matthew actually endorses keeping every last part of the law of Moses, including things like, yeah, you should not leave undone the tithing of dill and mint and cumin, but you also have to fulfill the weightier matters of the law. So that's the everything in the law of Moses and then some.
Of course, in that's kind of in a way makes Christians like, because there's things like circumcision, there are things like the slavery, grape, and who gets to marry who. Won't go much into detail of that on it. So of course they immediately throw, quote, what Jesus said under the bus, and somehow what his words said mean nothing.
We have something kind of in the middle in the book of Acts. At the end of the Jerusalem Council, Acts 15, verse 20, they decide, okay, people who come into following Jesus from outside of Judaism are not responsible for the law of Moses, but we're going to write down 4 laws. This is all they're responsible for. Abstain from idolatry, abstain from sexual immorality, abstain from things strangled, and abstain from blood.
And I believe that's more like I guess a quasi Noahide law. And that's not really the word on it, but it's kind of like a Noahide type law. And of course, many Christians reject that because they have things they have to follow. Oh, you have to do this thing. Well, most Christians say they don't have to do anything. So of course, that gets completely thrown out. And again, even if you point out these things, it's kind of like, well, I know that's what the Bible says, but, and it's like, why is there a but, even though the Bible said so?
There are no Christians around today who say Christians have 4 laws, and they're all listed in Acts 15:20, because that's not really popular. And then on the other end of the spectrum, the no laws and then some, that's Paul. Says we're not under the law anymore. But oh yeah, nature dictates that we have to do all this stuff or you won't see the kingdom of heaven. For instance, that long hair on a man is a disgrace, as nature indicates, which is laughably not true. But what Paul is doing here is taking Greco-Roman social conventions and elevating them to natural law. And for the most part, people have just ignored that.
Not to mention celibacy and a million other things. But they do like some of the things that Paul says because, oh yeah, eat pork all day long. Doesn't matter what you eat. Compared to if it's sacrifice to idols, go ahead and do it. It all becomes just say 2 baby Jesuses and you're fine. So a lot of people enjoy that train of thought and having no, quote, nothing to do.
And then we get to the actual popular rationalization for which laws continue to be relevant and which do not. One is the notion that the Hebrew Bible divides the laws into ceremonial and moral, and then many people add a third one that was developed, I think, first by Aquinas, the civil legislation. There are no such divisions anywhere in the Hebrew Bible, and the New Testament does not comprehensively outline any such divisions. That division actually originates in 3rd century theological writings, primarily with Origen.
Weird. Also around the same time where, right after that, we got the Trinity. So you see just the hedonism, Greco-Roman thinking and so on, just kind of like twisting, kind of just like, you just gotta push this right in there and make it seem right. And that's what a lot of Christians will say, that the Bible doesn't explicitly give you a complete set of laws, what you shouldn't do as well. So it kind of becomes you just gotta be followed by the Holy Spirit. Some will say that it just becomes really a mess.
So that is a post-biblical innovation as a means of rationalizing why we're going to keep some laws and not others. And one of the biggest problems with that is even in the New Testament and even in the 10 Commandments, some of the laws that are maintained are ceremonial. And some laws that are considered moral in the Hebrew Bible are not maintained. Now, the other popular one is the notion that if it's in the Hebrew Bible but is not mentioned in the New Testament, then it's no longer relevant. But if it's in the Hebrew Bible and then it is mentioned by the New Testament, and especially if it's mentioned by Jesus, then it continues to be relevant. This is also a post-biblical innovation, and this is another one that is inconsistently applied, because as I mentioned, according to Matthew, Jesus said all the law continues to be relevant, and Jesus explicitly quotes certain laws. So there's a bunch of stuff that Jesus repeats in the New Testament that most Christians just ignore today. And that's not even considering slavery. Laws about slavery are endorsed and repeated in the New Testament. There's no syllable of the Bible that in any way, shape, or form whatsoever questions the practice itself of buying, selling, and owning other humans. So if you...
But of course, there's 2 types, of course, because there's owning slaves are Hebrew. Those are the ones that, men only, those are the ones that are only allowed to be set free. Women and non-Jews, there's no, you'd own them as long as you want. You could actually become an inheritance as well. So people can inherit slaves and the sons and so on of slaves as well. So yeah, again, that's why a lot of Christians can get a little eked out when it comes to talking about the Old Testament, since they also believe that Jesus wrote it.
If you endorse the notion that it's still in effect if the New Testament or if Jesus repeated it, then why did we get rid of slavery? And what is common to all of this is that the consensus of the group determines what continues to be relevant. And that is why, after the 19th century, the overwhelming majority of Christians decided slavery, not for us anymore. We overruled the laws of the Bible. And Christians today, who like to appeal to these different frameworks for deciding what continues to be relevant and what does not, usually don't include the slave laws in whatever rationalization they prefer. The reality is that it is entirely arbitrary.
Here's what I am saying. No command from the Mosaic Law is incumbent upon me in virtue of being a part of that law. However, there are some commands that appear in the Old Testament that are repeated in the New Testament. That's because those commands are pointing to a universal moral law that is incumbent upon everyone.
So this is kind of merging the two contemporary rationalizations, the notion of eternal moral laws and temporary ceremonial laws merged with the notion that if it's repeated in the New Testament, then it continues to be relevant. And of course, this has to ignore a ton of stuff that these Christians don't want to continue to be relevant.
For example, there is a command against adultery in the Old Testament, and that command is there because adultery is wrong. And that's why adultery is also prohibited in the New Testament.
So does that mean you also need to stone them? Anybody? Or it's just something that's like, don't do it?
Except the prohibition of adultery in the Hebrew Bible did not prohibit a married man from engaging in sexual intercourse with as many other unmarried women as he wanted or sex workers, because it only prohibited women from engaging in premarital sex, and it only prohibited men from engaging in intercourse with other married women. In the New Testament, that changed. It's an entirely different law because both of them are socially and historically contingent, just like our approaches today to deciding what continues to be relevant and what does not is entirely socially and historically contingent.
In the same way, there is a command against homosexual sex in the Old Testament, and that command is there because it's wrong.
This is incorrect. The only thing that is prohibited in Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20 is a man taking the insertive role in an act of male same-sex intercourse. And this is prohibited not just because generically homosexual sex was wrong. Female same-sex intercourse is nowhere even addressed, much less condemned in the Hebrew Bible. It was prohibited because they believed that that violation of the social hierarchy of domination and penetration would generate a kind of metaphysical contaminant that would get out onto the land, and if that contamination reached a critical mass, then the land would vomit out the inhabitants.
This is very, it's very unclear, very weirdly done in the Old Testament, of course. The Quran prohibits all forms, both male and female. You can see how the Quran says, no, we came here to fix it, and say, no, it's actually for both men and women, both who are committing the act. For adultery, both male and female, in any form, shape, or way, and all of them receive the same punishment. Unlike what the Old Testament and the pseudo New Testament.
So that is an entirely false rationalization of the intuitive sexual disgust response on the part of the Holiness Code authors.
And that's why it's also prohibited in the New Testament.
No, in the New Testament, it is prohibited by Paul because he understands same-sex intercourse to be the product of a refusal to appropriately worship God, and so God removes the governor or the ceiling that they have placed on sexual desire so that it is allowed to bubble over and go in all kinds of inappropriate directions, resulting only among Gentiles in same-sex intercourse. Again, it's an entirely false rationalization for what ultimately comes down to an intuitive sexual disgust orientation.
Now, you might not agree with the conclusion, but at least accurately understand how Christians get to their conclusion rather than creating a straw man.
Christians get to their conclusions by considering the needs and the exigencies of their group within their contemporary social circumstances in light of their goals for the future, and then they go in search of a rationalization and a proof text text that authorizes.
Pointing out how Christians fail to follow a bunch of temporal Mosaic laws, like the prohibition against wearing clothes made of two different fabrics, only reveals a lack in understanding of how the covenants work.
Most of the laws in the Hebrew Bible that are dismissed as no longer relevant by Christians and as temporal laws are actually repeatedly described in the Hebrew Bible as eternal laws.
Yeah, I was like this. They have to do so much word salad and so much twisting and so much. I mean, they're literally throwing the Bible left and right, adding things, removing things, just to make the religion work. It's ridiculous.
The Mosaic law was limited to a time and nation, but objective morality isn't. In other words, Christians follow the moral law, not the Mosaic law.
No, Christians have always followed whatever laws have served the interest of the group, and as history repeatedly demonstrates, that has always been arbitrary and negotiable. And the fit for this video is frog and toad.
It's funny, I said, oh, we've always followed the moral law. Well, really. So when it comes to morality, when it comes to women, their place that has changed a million and quadruple times on there. Their view on slavery as well has continuously changed, even including now limited to some Christians arguing for it, as we see in the what is called the Southern Baptist Convention. So yes, it changes to the time, what they feel like, what they want, and their own personal views. Unlike the Quran, where we say no, doesn't matter your views, what time it is, time you're living in, whatever it says goes, no matter what. Let me know what you guys think about this video. Subscribe, like, comment, and share. Until next time.